The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Williams, a 28-year-old investment banker from New York, clutching his expensive camera and a steaming cup of coffee from the nearby cafe. He had flown to London specifically for this moment, determined to capture the perfect shot for his social media followers. Marcus had always been accustomed to getting his way. Growing up in a wealthy Manhattan family, he rarely heard the word no and had developed an entitled attitude that followed him into adulthood. His expensive suit, designer watch, and a confident swagger made him stand out among the mixed crowd of families. Elderly couples, budget travelers who had gathered to witness this centuries-old tradition. The royal guards began their approach, their iconic red tunics and tall bearskin hats creating a striking image against the palace backdrop. Leading the formation was Sergeant James Morrison, a decorated veteran who had served his country for 15 years. James had joined the military straight out of school, driven by a deep sense of duty and respect for his nation's traditions. His posture was perfect, his expression stoic, and his dedication absolute. As the guards marched in perfect synchronization, Marcus pushed his way through the crowd, ignoring the protests of other tourists. An elderly woman with a walking stick stumbled slightly as he shoved past her, but Marcus barely noticed. His focus was entirely on getting the best position for his photographs.
How nice.
Several people muttered complaints, but he dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "Excuse me, sir. You need to stay behind the barrier," a police officer politely informed Marcus as he stepped into the restricted area. The officer, Constable Sarah Thompson, had been managing crowd control for 3 years and was used to dealing with overeager tourists. Marcus barely glanced at her. "I'm a professional photographer," he lied smoothly, holding up his expensive camera as if it were credentials. "I have permission to be here." The confidence in his voice was convincing enough that Constable Thompson hesitated for a moment before. Insisting he move back behind the designated line, reluctantly, Marcus stepped back, but his frustration was building. He had paid thousands of dollars for this trip, stayed in a 5-star hotel, and expected VIP treatment wherever he went. The idea that he should follow the same rules as everyone else irritated him immensely. He pulled out his phone and began filming, providing commentary for his social media story. "So here I am at Buckingham Palace, and these guards are about to do their little parade," he said loudly into his phone, his voice carrying across the respectful silence of the crowd. "Let's see if this is worth all the hype." Several tourists turned to stare at him, clearly annoyed by his disruptive behavior. But Marcus seemed oblivious to their disapproval. Sergeant Morrison and his fellow guards continued their ceremonial duties, their training allowing them to maintain focus, despite distractions. They had dealt with difficult tourists before, though most visitors showed proper respect for the ceremony and the institution it represented. The changing of the guard was more than just a tourist attraction. It was a living symbol of British heritage and military tradition. As the ceremony progressed, Marcus became increasingly agitated by what he perceived as the guards' lack of acknowledgement of his presence. He was used to being the center of attention, and their professional indifference frustrated him. He began taking more aggressive photographs, using his flash despite clear signs prohibiting it, and moving closer to the restricted areas whenever he thought the police weren't watching. The crowd around him grew more uncomfortable with his behavior. Parents pulled their children closer, and several tourists began whispering complaints to each other in various languages. A middle-aged couple from Australia, who had saved for years to make this trip, found their view constantly blocked by Marcus's aggressive positioning and loud commentary. "This is ridiculous," Marcus muttered, checking his social media engagement. On his phone, his posts weren't getting the attention he had hoped for, which only added to his frustration. He had expected his London trip to generate significant buzz among his followers, boosting his personal brand and online presence. Sergeant Morrison, maintaining his stoic expression, was acutely aware of the disruption in the crowd. Years of training had taught him to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. He could sense the growing tension and the other tourists' discomfort. But his duty required him to continue the ceremony without breaking character or acknowledging distractions. The morning air was crisp, and steam rose from Marcus's coffee. Cup, as he grew more impatient, had scheduled a tight itinerary for his London visit, with meetings planned for later that afternoon. This ceremony was taking longer than he had expected, and his patience was wearing thin. The respectful silence of the other tourists, which they maintained out of reverence for the tradition, felt suffocating to someone accustomed to being the loudest voice in the room. As the guards moved through their precise formations, Marcus decided he needed a better angle for his shots. He spotted what he thought might be a gap in the security perimeter and began calculating his next move. His entitlement and impatience were building toward what would soon become an incident that none of the witnesses would ever forget. The stage was set for a confrontation between two completely different worldviews: Marcus's self-centered entitlement and Sergeant Morrison's disciplined dedication to duty. Neither man could have predicted how dramatically their paths were about to cross, or how the events of the next few minutes would change everything for both of them, creating a moment that would resonate far beyond the palace walls. The tension in the air became palpable as Marcus Williams made his decision to push boundaries even further. His expensive coffee cup trembled slightly in his hand as his impatience reached a boiling point. The ceremony was moving too slowly for his liking, and the guard's stoic professionalism felt like a personal insult to someone who expected immediate attention and accommodation. "Hey!" Marcus suddenly shouted across the courtyard, his voice cutting through the respectful silence like a knife. "Can you guys move a little faster? Some of us have places to be." His outburst caused immediate ripples through the crowd. Parents covered their children's ears. Elderly visitors shook their heads in disgust, and even some of the more relaxed tourists looked shocked by his blatant disrespect. Sergeant Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But his training, held firm, 15 years of military discipline, had taught him to maintain composure. Under far more challenging circumstances than one rude tourist, however, he couldn't help but think about the young soldiers under his command who looked up to him for guidance on how to handle such situations with dignity and professionalism. Constable Thompson immediately moved toward Marcus, her patience, with his behavior finally exhausted. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice or leave the premises," she said firmly but professionally. Her years of experience had taught her to de-escalate situations before they spiraled out of control, but she could see that Marcus was not going to be easily managed. Marcus turned on her with a sneer that revealed his true character. "Do you know who I am? I've spent more money in this country in the past 3 days than you probably make in a month. I have every right to be here, and I'll say whatever I want." His voice carried across the courtyard, and several tourists began pulling out their phones, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The crowd's reaction was swift and unified in their disapproval. A retired teacher from Wales stepped forward and said quietly but firmly, "Show some respect, young man. These soldiers serve our country." An American family on vacation nodded in agreement, with the father telling his teenage son, "This is exactly the kind of behavior that gives tourists a bad name." But Marcus was beyond caring about public opinion. His frustration had transformed into anger, and his privileged upbringing had never taught him how to handle situations where his wealth and status didn't automatically grant him special treatment. He began pacing back and forth behind the barrier, gesticulating wildly with his coffee cup and continuing his loud commentary. "This is supposed to be entertainment, right? Well, I'm not entertained. These guys just stand there like statues. What's the point?" His voice grew louder with each word, and the coffee in his cup sloshed dangerously close to the rim. Tourists began moving their children away from him, creating a small, empty space around his position. Sergeant Morrison's fellow guards remained perfectly disciplined, but he could sense their awareness of the situation. They had trained together for years, and their nonverbal communication was flawless. Without breaking their ceremonial formation, they managed to convey their readiness to support their sergeant if the situation escalated beyond what normal protocol could handle. A Japanese couple, visiting London for their anniversary, watched in embarrassment for Marcus. The husband whispered to his wife in their native language, expressing his shock that someone could be so disrespectful during such a meaningful ceremony. Their reaction was typical of the international visitors present, many of whom had traveled thousands of miles specifically to witness this tradition. Marcus noticed the crowd's reaction. It seemed to feed off the attention, even though it was entirely negative. His social media instincts kicked in, and he began filming himself while continuing his loud complaints. So apparently in England, you can't even express an opinion without everyone getting offended. These guards are public servants, right? Well, I'm the public, and I'm not satisfied with the service. The coffee cup in his hand became an extension of his agitated gestures, and several people instinctively stepped back as he waved it around carelessly. A young mother with a stroller positioned herself protectively between Marcus and her infant, while an elderly gentleman with military medals on his jacket looked on with visible disgust at the disrespectful display. Constable Thompson radioed for backup, recognizing that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. She had seen entitled tourists before, but Marcus's level of aggression and disrespect was exceptional. Her training told her that people like him often escalated their behavior when they felt their authority was being challenged. And she wanted to be prepared for whatever might happen next. The guards continued their ceremony with remarkable professionalism. But Sergeant Morrison was calculating potential responses to various scenarios. His primary responsibility was to maintain the dignity of the ceremony and protect the safety of all present, including the disruptive tourist who seemed determined to create a scene. As Marcus's ranting continued, something shifted in the crowd's energy. The initial shock and disapproval began transforming into something more protective and unified. These visitors from dozens of different countries and backgrounds found themselves united by their shared respect for tradition and their collective disgust at Marcus's behavior. An elderly woman from Scotland, visiting London with her grandchildren, spoke up with quiet authority that carried across the courtyard. In my 90 years, I've rarely seen such shameful behavior. These young men deserve our respect, not our insults. Her words resonated with many in the crowd, and several people began nodding in agreement. Marcus's response to this criticism was to become even more belligerent. Oh, great, now everyone's a critic. Look, lady, just because something is old doesn't make it worth respecting. This whole thing is just a show for tourists anyway. His dismissive wave sent more coffee sloshing in his cup, and the crowd collectively held its breath, sensing that something dramatic was about to happen. The moment that would forever change the dynamic in the palace courtyard began with Marcus Williams making a decision that would shock everyone present. His frustration had reached a peak, and his entitled mindset convinced him that dramatic action was necessary to get the attention he felt he deserved. The coffee cup in his hand, which had been trembling with his agitation, suddenly became a weapon of disrespect. Without warning, Marcus stepped closer to the ceremonial area and, with a deliberate motion born of pure arrogance, threw the contents of his coffee cup directly at Sergeant Morrison. The hot liquid splashed across the sergeant's pristine red tunic, staining the fabric and creating a moment of stunned silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps echoed across the courtyard, followed by angry shouts from tourists who couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Several people began filming with their phones, capturing what would soon become one of the most viral videos on social media. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer, while elderly visitors looked on in complete shock at the unprecedented act of disrespect. Sergeant Morrison felt the warm liquid seep through his uniform, but his training kicked in immediately. 15 years of military discipline had prepared him for many situations, but this level of civilian disrespect was something entirely new. His first instinct was to maintain his position and composure, even as the coffee dripped down his tunic and onto his polished boots. The other guards in the formation remained perfectly still, their training overriding their natural impulse to respond to the assault on their sergeant. However, their eyes betrayed their anger and readiness to act if the situation escalated further. The ceremonial nature of their duty required them to maintain discipline, but they were also prepared. To protect their fellow soldier if necessary, Marcus stepped back, a look of satisfaction crossing his face as he surveyed the chaos he had created. "There," he said loudly. "Now maybe you'll pay attention to paying customers instead of just standing there like mannequins." His words carried across the silent courtyard, and the crowd's anger toward him became almost palpable. Constable Thompson immediately moved into action, her backup officers arriving just as the coffee hit the sergeant's uniform. "Sir, you are under arrest for assault," she announced firmly, approaching Marcus with her handcuffs ready. The seriousness in her voice made it clear that this was no longer just a matter of crowd control or tourist management. The crowd began expressing their outrage more vocally as a veteran with a prosthetic leg visiting the palace with his family stepped forward and addressed Marcus directly. "You've just assaulted a man who has served his country with honor. The uniform represents sacrifice and dedication that someone like you could never understand." His words resonated with many in the crowd, who began nodding and voicing their agreement. Marcus's confidence began to waver as he realized the severity of his actions and the unified anger of everyone around him. "It was just coffee," he said, defensively, but his voice lacked the arrogance it had carried moments before. "He's fine. It's not like I hurt him." His attempt to minimize his actions only served to further anger the crowd and the police. Officers surrounding him, a middle-aged woman from Germany, who had been quietly observing the ceremony with her husband, spoke up with tears in her eyes. "My grandfather was a soldier. It would be a shame to see such disrespect shown to anyone in uniform." Her emotional response reflected the feelings of many international visitors who had come to London specifically to experience British traditions and culture. Sergeant Morrison, still maintaining his position despite the stained uniform and the disruption to the ceremony, made a decision that would define the moment. Rather than breaking formation or responding with anger, he chose to demonstrate the professionalism and dignity that his uniform represented. Damn. His composure in the face of such blatant disrespect began to have a powerful effect on everyone watching. The backup officers efficiently surrounded Marcus, but the crowd's attention remained focused on Sergeant Morrison. His ability to maintain his dignity and continue his duty despite the assault was speaking volumes about his character and the values he represented. The contrast between his behavior and Marcus's couldn't have been more stark. A young student from France, studying abroad in London, began recording the scene while whispering to her friend, "This is incredible. Look how professional he's being, even after what that horrible man did to him." Her observation was being echoed in multiple languages throughout the crowd as international visitors witnessed British military professionalism firsthand. Marcus found himself surrounded by police officers, but his attention was drawn to the crowd's reaction rather than his legal situation. For the first time since arriving in London, he was getting the attention he had craved, but it was entirely negative. The realization that he had become the villain in this scenario began to sink in as he noticed the phones recording his every move. An elderly couple from Canada, who had served in their country's military decades earlier, watched with a mixture of anger at Marcus and admiration for Sergeant Morrison. The husband turned to his wife and said quietly, "That young sergeant is showing what true strength looks like. It takes more courage to maintain dignity than to respond with anger." The coffee stain on Sergeant Morrison's uniform had become a symbol of the clash between entitlement and duty, between disrespect and honor. As the police began processing Marcus's arrest, the crowd's focus shifted entirely to supporting the guards and expressing their appreciation for their continued professionalism in the face of such unprecedented disrespect. The ceremony, which had been disrupted by Marcus's outrageous behavior, was about to continue in a way that none of the witnesses would ever forget. The sergeant's response to this assault would prove that true strength comes not from retaliation, but from maintaining one's principles even when faced with the worst behavior from others. What happened next would be remembered by every witness as one of the most powerful demonstrations of dignity and professionalism they had ever seen. As Marcus Williams stood, surrounded by police officers, expecting some form of retaliation or at least acknowledgement of his disrespectful act, Sergeant Morrison did something completely unexpected that would silence the entire crowd and create a moment of profound impact. Instead of breaking formation or showing any sign of anger, Sergeant Morrison made a subtle gesture that only his fellow guards would recognize. With the slightest nod, barely perceptible to the untrained eye, he signaled to his men that the ceremony would continue. The coffee stain spreading across his red tunic would not diminish the honor of their service or the importance of their duty to the crown and country. The crowd watched in amazement as Sergeant Morrison straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin with even more pride than before, and began to march forward with his unit. The coffee stain, rather than being a mark of shame, seemed to transform into a badge of honor that demonstrated his unshakable commitment to his duties. His composure was so complete that it appeared as if the assault had never happened. A profound silence fell over the courtyard. Even Marcus, who had been preparing defensive arguments for the police, found himself speechless as he witnessed the sergeant's response. The entitled tourist had expected anger, confrontation, or at least some acknowledgement of his actions. Instead, was faced with a level of professionalism and dignity that his privileged upbringing had never prepared him to understand. An American veteran in the crowd, visiting London with his wife for their 40th wedding anniversary, wiped tears from his eyes as he watched the guards continue their ceremony. "Honey," he whispered to his wife, "I served for 22 years and I've never seen such grace under pressure. That young man just showed everyone what it means to serve with honor." The guards' synchronization became even more precise as they rallied around their sergeant's example. Each soldier seemed to draw strength from Morrison's composure, and their formation moved with renewed purpose and pride. The ceremony, which Marcus had tried to disrupt and diminish, was elevated to something far more meaningful than any of the tourists had expected to witness. Constable Thompson, while processing Marcus's arrest, found herself moved by the sergeant's response. In her years of law enforcement, she had seen countless examples of people responding to provocation with anger or retaliation. Watching Morrison choose dignity over revenge restored her faith in the power of true leadership and self-control. The crowd began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Phones that had been recording Marcus's disrespectful behavior now focused entirely on the guards' continued professionalism. The videos being captured would soon spread across social media, but the story would not be about the tourists' bad behavior. It would be about the incredible response of the Royal Guard. A group of school children from a local London primary school who had come on a field trip to learn about British history and traditions watched with wide eyes as their teacher used the moment as an impromptu lesson about character and resilience. "Children," she whispered, "you're seeing what real strength looks like. It's not about fighting back. It's about doing the right thing even when others don't." Marcus, still in police custody, began to realize that his actions had backfired completely. Instead of getting attention for himself, he had inadvertently created a moment that highlighted everything noble about the institution he had tried to mock. The sergeant's grace under pressure made Marcus's behavior appear even more childish and disrespectful by comparison. An elderly woman from Ireland, who had lost her son in military service, approached the barrier with tears streaming down her face. She called out in a voice that carried across the courtyard, "Thank you for your service. Thank you for showing us what honor looks like." Her words seemed to speak for the entire crowd, and several people began nodding and murmuring their agreement. The international tourists present began sharing the moment with friends, family around the world through social media. A businessman from Japan posted, "Witnessing true British character today at Buckingham Palace. The professionalism of these guards in the face of disrespect is incredible." Similar messages were being sent in dozens of languages as the story began to spread globally. Sergeant Morrison's fellow guards drew inspiration from his example, and their performance of the ceremony reached new levels of precision and pride. What had started as a routine changing of the guard had transformed into a powerful demonstration of military values and personal character that would be remembered long after the tourists returned home. The coffee stain on Morrison's uniform had become something symbolic rather than shameful. Instead of representing Marcus's disrespect, it had become a visible reminder of the sergeant's choice to respond with dignity rather than anger. The contrast between the two men's characters could not have been more clearly illustrated as the ceremony continued. Members of the crowd began quietly discussing what they had witnessed. Conversations in multiple languages all centered around the same theme: admiration for the sergeant's response and disgust at the tourist's behavior. The incident was creating an unexpected sense of unity among strangers from around the world. Marcus found himself becoming increasingly uncomfortable as he realized that his attempt to assert dominance had instead highlighted his own character flaws. The police officers processing his arrest were professional but clearly disgusted by his actions, and the crowd's continued support for the guards made his isolation complete. The moment was building toward something even more powerful. As Sergeant Morrison's example began to inspire responses from others in the crowd that would create an even more memorable conclusion to this extraordinary encounter between entitlement and honor. The crowd's response to Sergeant Morrison's extraordinary display of professionalism began to build into something spontaneous and deeply moving. What started as individual expressions of admiration and support gradually transformed into a collective demonstration of respect that no one present would ever forget. The tourists, from dozens of different countries and backgrounds, found themselves united by their shared appreciation for the sergeant's dignity in the face of such blatant disrespect. A middle-aged man from Australia, who had been quietly filming the ceremony for his grandchildren back home, stepped forward and began to applaud. His clapping was slow and deliberate, each strike of his hands carrying the weight of genuine respect and admiration. Within seconds, his gesture was picked up by others in the crowd, and soon the entire courtyard was filled with the sound of sustained applause. The applause was unlike anything typically heard at tourist attractions. It wasn't the brief, polite clapping that might follow a performance, but rather a deep, heartfelt expression of gratitude and respect. The sound echoed off the palace walls, creating an atmosphere of reverence that transformed the space from a tourist destination into something approaching a sacred ceremony. Sergeant Morrison, maintaining his military bearing, felt the weight of the crowd's support, but remained focused on his duties. However, those who knew him well could see the almost imperceptible straightening of his shoulders and the subtle lift of his chin that indicated how much the crowd's recognition meant to him. His years of service had taught him humility, but this moment validated everything he had dedicated his life to defending. Marcus, still surrounded by police officers, watched in growing horror as he realized that his actions had created exactly the opposite effect of what he had intended. Instead of humiliating the guard or disrupting the ceremony, he had inadvertently orchestrated one of the most powerful demonstrations of respect and unity that the palace grounds had ever witnessed. His attempt to assert his importance had instead highlighted his own insignificance. A young soldier in the formation, Private David Chen, fought back tears as he heard the applause continuing to build around them. He had joined the military just 2 years earlier, inspired by stories of service and honor, but had sometimes wondered if those values still meant anything in the modern world. This moment proved that they did, and that people still recognized and appreciated true dedication to duty. An elderly couple from France, both survivors of World War II, stood hand in hand as they applauded. The husband, who had lived through the occupation of his homeland, understood better than most what it meant to have soldiers who would maintain their dignity and discipline even under attack. His wife wiped away tears as she remembered her own father, who had served with similar honor decades earlier. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 5 minutes. During this time, something remarkable happened to the overall atmosphere in the courtyard. The anger and tension that Marcus's behavior had created was being transformed into something positive and unifying. His act of disrespect had inadvertently created an opportunity for hundreds of strangers to express their shared values. Children in the crowd began to understand that they were witnessing something important. Even if they couldn't fully comprehend the deeper meaning, parents took the opportunity to explain concepts of honor, respect, and doing the right thing even when others behaved badly. The incident became an impromptu lesson in character for an entire generation of young witnesses. Social media posts about the incident began spreading across platforms worldwide. However, instead of focusing on Marcus's negative behavior, most of the content celebrated Sergeant Morrison's response. Videos of the sustained applause were shared millions of times, with comments praising the guard's professionalism and the crowd's unified support. The story became a positive viral phenomenon rather than just another example of tourist misbehavior. A group of American college students studying abroad in London found themselves deeply moved by what they were witnessing. One of them, a young woman studying international relations, later wrote in her blog, "Today I saw what leadership really looks like. It's not about power or authority. It's about maintaining your principles, even when someone tries to tear them down. That soldier taught me more about strength in 5 minutes than I've learned in 4 years of university." Marcus's legal situation was becoming increasingly serious as the police officers documented the assault and gathered witness statements. However, the crowd's focus remained entirely on supporting the guards rather than condemning the tourist. This collective choice to focus on the positive rather than the negative demonstrated a maturity and wisdom that elevated the entire experience. The guards' performance of their ceremonial duties reached new heights of precision and pride as they drew energy from the crowd's support. Every movement became more deliberate, every formation more perfect. They were no longer just performing a routine ceremony. They were participating in a moment that celebrated everything their service represented. As the applause finally began to fade, it was replaced by something even more powerful, a profound silence filled with respect and admiration. The crowd remained quiet, but their continued presence and attention spoke volumes about how deeply they had been affected by what they had witnessed. Many people made no move to leave. Despite the formal ceremony being complete, Sergeant Morrison's example had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the immediate incident. The tourists present would return to their home countries with a story about British values and military professionalism. More importantly, they had witnessed firsthand that dignity and honor were not outdated concepts but living principles that could inspire and unite people across all cultural boundaries. The stage was set for the final resolution of this extraordinary encounter, where the long-term consequences of both men's choices would become clear, and where the true meaning of the day's events would be fully revealed to everyone present. In the days and weeks that followed the incident at Buckingham Palace, the true impact of that extraordinary morning began to unfold in ways that neither Sergeant Morrison nor Marcus Williams could have anticipated. The video footage captured by dozens of tourists spread across social media platforms with unprecedented speed. But the story that emerged was not the one Marcus had intended to create. Sergeant Morrison turned to his barracks that evening to find messages of support flooding in from around the world. Military personnel from different countries shared their admiration for his composure, while civilians expressed their gratitude for his example of grace under pressure. The coffee-stained uniform, which he had expected to be a source of embarrassment, had instead become a symbol of unshakable professionalism that inspired countless people. The British Ministry of Defence, initially concerned about the negative publicity the incident might generate, found themselves managing an entirely different situation. International media outlets were praising British military training and values, using Sergeant Morrison's response as an example of the character and discipline that the nation's armed forces represented. What could have been a diplomatic embarrassment had instead become a powerful demonstration of British military excellence. Marcus Williams faced immediate legal consequences for his assault on the Royal Guard. The British justice system, while fair, took such offenses seriously, particularly when they involved attacks on members of the military during ceremonial duties. His expensive lawyers struggled to minimize the charges, but the video evidence and numerous witness statements made his case nearly impossible to defend. More significantly, Marcus discovered that his actions had severe personal and professional repercussions. The viral videos of his behavior reached his employer in New York, where his conduct was seen as a serious liability to the company's reputation. His social media presence, which he had hoped to enhance with his London trip, became a source of shame rather than pride. Job opportunities dried up as potential employers discovered his role in the incident. The contrast between the two men's post-incident experiences became stark. While Sergeant Morrison received commendations and recognition, Marcus found himself facing social ostracism and professional consequences that would follow him for years. His entitlement and disrespect had not only failed to achieve his goals, but had actively destroyed much of what he had worked to build in his career. Back at the palace, the changing of the guard ceremony took on new meaning for both the guards and the tourists who witnessed it. Visitors began arriving specifically hoping to see Sergeant Morrison and his unit. Drawn by the story of their professionalism in the face of adversity, the ceremony, which had always been significant, now carried additional weight as a symbol of dignity. Triumphing over disrespect, the international tourists who had witnessed the original incident became ambassadors for the story, sharing their experiences with friends and family around the world. Their accounts consistently focus not on Marcus's negative behavior, but on the incredible response of the Royal Guard and the crowd's unified support. The story became a positive example of human nature rather than a cautionary tale about tourist misbehavior. Sergeant Morrison was eventually promoted, though he insisted that he had simply done what any professional soldier should do in similar circumstances. His humility in the face of recognition only added to the respect he had earned. Young recruits joining the military began citing his example as inspiration for their own service, and his response to the coffee-throwing incident became part of military leadership training programs. The elderly woman from Scotland, who had spoken up in defense of the guards during the incident, received her own share of recognition. Her grandchildren, who had initially been embarrassed by her outspokenness, found themselves proud to be related to someone who had stood up for what was right. Her words during that moment became a family legacy that would be passed down for generations. Marcus eventually completed his legal obligations and returned to New York. But the experience had fundamentally changed his perspective. The complete failure of his entitled approach, contrasted with the universal admiration for Sergeant Morrison's dignity, forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own character. Some who knew him reported that the incident had sparked genuine self-reflection and attempts at personal growth. The video of Sergeant Morrison, maintaining his composure while coffee dripped from his uniform, became one of the most shared military-related videos in social media history. It was used in leadership seminars, character education programs, and military training courses around the world. The brief moment of professionalism had created a lasting legacy that would influence countless future leaders. Years later, tourists still visit Buckingham Palace, hoping to recreate the positive energy of that remarkable morning. Tour guides tell the story of the coffee incident as an example of the values that the Royal Guard represents, and visitors from around the world continue to express their appreciation for the British military's professionalism and dedication. The incident ultimately demonstrated that respect cannot be demanded through aggression or entitlement, but must be earned through character and consistency. Marcus's attempt to force attention through disrespectful behavior had backfired completely, while Sergeant Morrison's quiet dignity had earned him its international recognition and admiration that would last for the rest of his career. The stained uniform was eventually retired to a military museum, where it serves as a reminder that true strength comes not from retaliation, but from maintaining one's principles even under attack. The coffee stain, once a symbol of disrespect, had been transformed into a badge of honor that continues to inspire visitors from around the world. In the end, both men got exactly what they deserved. Marcus faced the consequences of his entitled behavior, while Sergeant Morrison received the recognition that his character and professionalism had earned. The lasting lesson of that morning at Buckingham Palace became clear to everyone who witnessed it or heard the story afterward. True power comes not from wealth, status, or the ability to disrupt others, but from the strength to maintain dignity and purpose, even when faced with the worst behavior from others. Sergeant Morrison's response proved that respect is earned through consistent character rather than demanded through aggressive action. The incident also revealed the power of collective response to injustice. The crowd's spontaneous applause and unified support demonstrated that most people, regardless of their nationality or background, recognize and appreciate genuine character when they see it. Their reaction turned what could have been a negative experience into a celebration of positive values. For the many tourists who witnessed the event, it became a defining memory of their visit to London. They had expected to see a ceremonial changing of the guard, but instead experienced a profound lesson about human nature, dignity, and the way true leaders respond to challenges. Many later described it as the most meaningful part of their entire trip. The story continues to be shared in military academies, leadership programs, and character education courses around the world. It serves as a perfect example of how to maintain professionalism under pressure and how dignity can triumph over disrespect. The coffee-stained uniform in the museum receives thousands of visitors each year. It's all drawn by the story of the man who wore it with such honor. Marcus Williams eventually found a path toward personal redemption, though it took years of genuine self-reflection and effort to rebuild his reputation and relationships. His experience at Buckingham Palace became a turning point that forced him to confront his entitled attitudes and work toward becoming a better person. While he never achieved the fame he had originally sought, he eventually found more meaningful success through humility and service to others. Sergeant Morrison continued his military career with the same quiet professionalism that had made him famous that morning. He never sought to capitalize on his moment of fame, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. His example inspired a generation of soldiers who learned that true strength lies not in the ability to fight back, but in the discipline to maintain one's principles regardless of provocation. The incident at Buckingham Palace stands as a timeless reminder that our character is revealed not by how we act when everything is going well, but by how we respond when faced with unexpected challenges. In that moment of crisis, Sergeant Morrison chose dignity over anger, service over self-interest, and professionalism over personal satisfaction. His choice created a legacy that continues to inspire people around the world to choose the higher path when confronted with disrespect or injustice. The coffee may have been thrown in anger and entitlement, but it ended up highlighting everything noble about duty, service, and the power of maintaining one's principles under pressure. Sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is simply to continue being who you are supposed to be, regardless of how others choose to behave.